A triple bewitching hour for Republicans. Congressman Duncan Hunter and his wife are indicted and arraigned for personal use of campaign funds. He remains defiant, blaming the DOJ's deep state for a political witch hunt and blaming his wife. Meanwhile, a jury convicts President Trump's former campaign chairman on 8 counts of bank fraud and tax evasion. And Trump's personal lawyer pleads guilty to campaign finance violations he says were directed by the president. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, reporter Morgan Cook of the San Diego Union Tribune, columnist Michael Smolens of the Union Tribune, reporter Jade Heidemann of KPBS News, and KPBS North County reporter Allison St. John. Well, Republicans from San Diego to Washington, D.C. and beyond are reeling following Tuesday's triple whammy. President Trump's former campaign manager convicted on 8 counts of fraud. His personal lawyer pleaded guilty to campaign finance violations implicating the president in a conspiracy to influence the election. And a San Diego congressman, one of the president's most devoted supporters, and his wife were indicted here for years of paying personal expenses with campaign donations. Duncan Hunter, arraigned yesterday with wife Margaret, refuses to resign and vows to fight the charges, accusing the Justice Department of a political witch hunt. He's been stripped of his committee assignments after GOP House Speaker Paul Ryan launched an ethics investigation into what he called deeply serious charges. And we're starting with Duncan Hunter right there. Morgan, you've covered this with your colleagues at the UT for a long time. Give us the nuts and bolts of this indictment.
So this indictment has 60 counts in it, and it names Hunter and his wife, Margaret, as defendants. And they face charges including wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy, falsification of records, and prohibited use of campaign finance money.
Okay, and it's very detailed. I mean, it reads like a narrative. It's pretty clearly laid out and fairly easy to follow. You know, and it covers a number of years now. Hunter says the questionable expenses were in the $60,000 to $65,000 range, paid his campaign back, pretty much that amount. But this indictment seems to be a whole bigger scope than that.
Right. The indictment covers 2009, end of 2009 to the end of 2016, and it lays out about 200 instances of alleged wrongdoing. And so they get kind of specific and detailed.
Give us a couple of examples here. There's little ones and fairly big ones.
Right. There are little ones like a trip to Disneyland where they went to the gift shop and bought Minnie Mouse ears and stuff and then described it as food and beverages, and the FEC reports to sort of hide it, allegedly. And also, you know, then there were bigger ones like a trip to Italy, a family trip to Italy, and then trying to get a tour of a Navy facility there to kind of give it a feel of official purpose. And so all of that went on for allegedly a pretty long time, and they misused, allegedly, $250,000.
And over again, the indictment says the treasurer raised red flags, questioned this, questioned that, and it didn't simply hold any water.
It did not appear to change things, but it does seem that the treasurer repeatedly said, I think we have a problem here. This isn't really allowed. This is, you know, we need to try to rein it in because we can't, you know, it's not okay.
Now, it also paints a picture of the Hunters having serious financial troubles. I mean, what was it, 1,100 bounce checks or overdraws on accounts?
1,100 overdraws, and I think like $37,000 of overdraft fees and stuff. We had an idea that their financial situation was a little stressed because in the annual financial disclosures that all the members of Congress file, their personal finances, he's never reported having more than $1,000 in the bank, and he had some loans on his house and stuff. So the way that he got this money to repay his campaign was with a loan, a third loan, you know, using his home as equity, I guess. And then he had to sell his house to repay that loan. And so that sort of gave us an idea of financial stress. But
and for the record, what does a U.S. congressman make?
$174,000 a year.
And his wife Margaret was on the payroll for some of this period as well, right?
Yes, and she was. They were paying her $3,000 a month.
Okay, as a campaign manager.
Yes.
Okay. Now, Union Tribune. When did you get interested in this? What was the origin of the story for the paper?
In April of 2016, the Federal Election Commission sent a letter to Hunter's campaign that said, "Hey, we noticed that you have, more than 60 charges here to Steam Games, this video game website, and they're marked personal expenses, need to be reimbursed. Also, this Christian Unified School District, this tuition needs to be reimbursed. So could you give us a little more information on that?" So we took that letter and reported that news and we put a story up the 5th, April 5th, 2016, and that's when the news broke. And then we just sort of followed that.
More and more started coming to light.
Right, well, we
slowly.
wanted to make sure that this was a one-off, right? Because we reported on the video games and we were like, ooh, well, that's a mistake, but hopefully it was the only mistake, and then we went back through and saw that other charges were marked personal, needs to be mistaken, needs to be reimbursed, and some charges that were reimbursed. So then we started looking into those.
And reporting as you went, just more and more coming to light.
Right, reporting as we went, more and more. And then my editor, Ricky, said he sort of stepped back and looked at the bigger picture. And he said, well, man, what's with all the Jack in the Box? And what's with all the Albertsons? And these patterns kind of emerged that were interesting to us because we didn't see them on any other people's candidates' campaign.
Just these personal expenses,
right.
One after the other.
Unusual things, remarkable things you don't see.
So, Jade, I wanted to turn to you and start in on the reaction to this. What has been Duncan Hunter's reaction to this investigation and now this indictment and arraignment?
Well, now, he's defiant. He denies taking any accountability for these expenses. And he said, what did he say? He said there was nothing criminal about being poor, is what he said. But, of course, it becomes criminal when you put your hand in the campaign cookie jar. And that's what this indictment alleges.
What the government's saying, yeah.
Right.
All right, we do have a soundbite here from Duncan Hunter talking this week about the indictment. Let's hear that.
We're going to court.
So you think you'll be able
and I'm going to win in court and win my election, and we'll see where we are, right?
Have you talked to your wife about this?
And let the American people, but let the people decide here too. What the government likes to do is take away the power from the people to have an election. So let's have an election. Let's go to trial. Then you can all see that, and we'll see who wins.
All right, Michael, now he has also talked about this deep state within the Department of Justice out to get Republicans. You got a column on that today. How is that argument going to fly?
Well, he's mirroring what Donald Trump has been saying, but Duncan Hunter, actually even more so than Trump, I think, has been injecting the term democratic deep state, which is pretty odd because the U.S. attorney in San Diego is a Republican. And all this stuff was signed off by top Republicans in the Justice Department. As I said in the column today, a sitting Congress member is not going to be indicted without the Attorney General signing off on it. I mean, that's a big deal. That goes to the top. And so various things along the way. Now, he's mentioned that there's an instance, and it gives him a talking point, and there has not been a good explanation for it. A couple of the prosecutors involved in this case went to a Hillary Clinton fundraiser, and they wanted the office recused, the San Diego office recused. But, like I said, that he's trying to sort of paint this as part of this larger cabal to overturn the Republican-controlled government. That's a tough sell, especially when really his biggest problem is, and I think that Morgan touched on some of this, people that have been close to him. If you go through the indictment, I mean, obviously a lot's well documented, but a lot of the information comes from people in the know, whether it's, I don't know if it's a campaign treasurer, a chief of staff, his wife. We know she had been talking with prosecutors or investigators as well. So it's sort of the Hunter insiders that were providing a lot of this information.
It's a tough sell, but conspiracy theories really appeal to the base.
Oh, absolutely.
At the moment, so it's very effective.
Yeah, I spoke with Elkhorn Mayor Bill Wells, who ran against Duncan Hunter, really sort of as a fail-safe. In our top two primary, two people from the same party can go to the general election, and that's sort of how he's selling himself. If we don't have another Republican, and basically this happens, we're in trouble. The Republicans didn't buy it. He really didn't get that kind of support. But I talked to him about that specifically, and he said he got a lot of anger from people because they're saying, Duncan Hunter's a victim of this conspiracy. So, right. People do believe it. And it's not like there hasn't been politically motivated prosecutions by the federal government in the past. So, you always have to kind of be wary about before you just dismiss these things out of hand. But in this case, it's hard to make that case.
But how dangerous is it to democracy for everyone to buy into this deep state conspiracy?
Well, I think that this has been done at several levels. The big threat here, concern, is the President of the United States. I mean, and this is his own Justice Department, the U.S. legal system that basically he's accusing is fraudulent or rigged and so forth. And I think that has some long-term issues because, a lot of people believe this. And, I mean, let's face it, whatever you think about Donald Trump, a lot of people believe what the President of the United States has to say. And so this is a big thing. To a lesser level, with Duncan Hunter, does it happen? Yeah, it certainly does. Because, like I said, Bill Wells firsthand got an earful.
Jade, I wanted to turn back to this arraignment yesterday, extraordinary event downtown. Set the scene for us there. What was it like in the federal court? You have this couple being arraigned together.
Sure. So both Duncan Hunter and his wife Margaret, they arrived separately. Duncan first and his wife Margaret several minutes after that. She walked in with her attorneys. Duncan stood up to greet the attorneys and to greet his wife, and it was a very cold reception. She walked right past him. He just attempted to pat her on the back as she walked by and sat several seats down. There was little eye contact between the two as well. The only time that they were actually standing together was when they were standing before the judge.
Okay, and we saw the folks watching on TV, there were protesters outside. We heard a little lock 'em up chant here. It was echoing, of course, the Trump rallies and his supporters and Hillary Clinton in the national scene.
Sure.
Michael, what's been the reaction of Republican leaders to the indictment of
Well, you mentioned Speaker Ryan, who finds this all very troubling and immediately moved to strip him of his committee assignments. It was interesting because initially Duncan Hunter was going to fight that and bring it to the House Republican Conference, and then I believe it was just yesterday that he sent a letter saying, he would step back from his committee. It's some find it troubling. Darrell Issa, on the other hand, he's accusing the prosecution of malfeasance because he's saying this is coming out too soon to the election, and that's an interesting thing because as we remember, in 2016, there were similar concerns about what then FBI Director James Comey did when he reopened the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails just before a lot closer than this. And I don't know what goes on in a situation like this in a U.S. Attorney's office, but I have a feeling that there's this thing about Labor Day is the official or the real stretch run of the campaign, and if you've got this information, do you want to actually sit on it? And if you go with the Darrell Issa aspect, well, it's not fair to do it before. So you indict him right after the election, and people saying, you mean you were sitting on this all along and you didn't let the voters know? So you can look at it both ways, but that's kind of the argument. But just to getting back, that's sort of been the local Republican reaction.
I mean, just because the indictment's been announced, it's going to take months. So it's not like this is going to resolve until after the election.
It's not going to trial next week.
And so, for Darrell Issa, who has in the past, there have been rumors that he might throw his hat into the ring. It doesn't really matter if it all comes to pass after the election, even if Hunter gets elected. And the indictment goes through and he has to resign, that would be a perfect situation for Darrell Issa to jump right in.
All right, well, this is a good point to talk about his opponent, his Democratic opponent in this race. Okay. And we all got some releases from his opponent, as we saw this week. We'll get to that question in a moment. But I'm trying to set up a soundbite to hear from him. But tell us, who is running against Duncan Hunter, and this has kind of energized his campaign, right?
So Kempa Najjar has actually done very well, considering that
full name is Ammar Kempa Najjar. Long name.
Palestinian, Mexican American, and very interesting candidate who actually managed to defeat a military veteran who was running as a Democrat, and one would have thought that perhaps they would have gotten a higher support in the election, but he still has come out. I think he is managing to connect with the voters quite effectively, although he's still running way behind Hunter in the polls, so it's a long shot. And
have we seen any polls since all this happened, or is it too soon?
I think it's too soon since this happened.
So that could be interesting to see what maybe the next poll says. Well, we do, as I say, have a soundbite. Let's hear from the candidate.
I'm running for everybody in this district, not just the resistors or the Trumpsters, but everybody. And I know that nothing in life is given. I didn't inherit a seat from my dad. And I didn't sell my votes to the highest bidders in Washington so I could live lavishly while the people in my district languish. So my focus is to make sure not to take this for granted, and me and my supporters are going to be campaigning as if we're not running against a corrupt, indicted congressman.
All right, and as we see, he's going right at the meat and potatoes of that indictment.
Although right after the indictment, and you were there, he was actually quite gentlemanly in his comments about Hunter, I think.
He was. He was very, in short, thankful for Duncan Hunter's service to the country, but said, you know what, I think that he's had a hard time and that perhaps this man never came back from war. He never came back from the battlefield or whatever. So, he's been very gracious in his comments, very kind about it, but then still driving right to the point.
Well, let's get to this news release here. Let's just bring this up. His campaign, Campa Najjar's campaign, cites several references in the indictment, very clear if you read it, that Hunter was also using campaign funds for mistresses on a Tahoe ski trip, Virginia Beach trip, D.C. hotel room, some other charges here. This has been referenced elsewhere, too, and Hunter's own attorney has referenced this, a story, notable story early in the year in Politico.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting in the indictment that it was so specific as to sort of detail the relationship that Duncan had with each person, each individual, whether it was
named, by the way.
Exactly.
They're numbered.
They're numbered. They're numbered. Individual 1, individual 2.
A, B, C, 14, 15, 16.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of these relationships, they're either golfing buddies or they're relationships that both he and Margaret have. When you get to individual 14 through about 18, right? You guys know about this. Suddenly these are personal relationships with just Duncan Hunter. And what we see, like right here on 12 in the indictment, it says Hunter spent $1,008.72 in campaign funds at the Hyatt Regency Lake Tahoe Resort Spa and Casino for food, drinks, and 3 nights lodging during a personal ski trip with individual 14. Not to mention, we're going to go on, and it says, on this day, the Hunter family bank account had a negative balance and incurred 6 separate insufficient funds fees totaling $198. And also on this same day, Duncan Hunter withdrew $20 from his personal bank account, leaving a balance of $15.02. These instances are all outlined in this indictment on a number of pages.
That's quite a mouthful in one paragraph of the indictment, Alice.
But, I mean, I understand that his attorney, Greg Varga, has really suggested to the Justice Department that these should not be investigated because having extramarital affairs, perhaps, it's not illegal and has nothing to do with any kind of legal proceedings.
As long as you use your personal funds.
As long as you use your personal funds. So I think the issue is more the money. Where does the money come from?
No, but see, now here back in 2006, he voted to define marriage as one man, one woman. And now if we look at this indictment, there might have been at least 3 or 4 people in his marriage. How you're voting and things like that matters.
I see where Allison's coming from and where you're coming from, but the reason why I will respectfully disagree with Greg Vega, a very good attorney,
very good attorney,
former U.S. attorney, by the way. I mean, I think you have to point out who the money was spent on, because if Duncan Hunter's claiming this is a campaign expense, okay, what did this person have to do anything with campaigning? And I understand that Vega's trying to say, oh, they're trying to just, throw a lot out there, but I kind of get the legal strategy or reasoning that they point out the mistresses.
In the paper, Morgan has a lot of information on the financial aspects, but you haven't brought up very much about these rather more salacious details, which could do him a lot more harm in the election.
Yeah, Morgan.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I don't understand, haven't been able to understand, is that these trips with these individuals who could be women, I guess. I don't understand how that jives really with what he's been saying about how he didn't know about any of these charges. He didn't make any of these charges. Is he suggesting that his wife paid for them?
Right.
Because it doesn't
add up.
I don't understand. So.
A lot of questions there. Allison, this is not the first local congressman to get in some hot water and
yes,
calls for him
it's
to
so
resign.
interesting. It's almost like the 50th district is jinxed, isn't it? Because we had Randy Duke Cunningham back in 2005, who ended up resigning after he was found guilty of tax evasion, tax fraud, and bribery, essentially, $2.5 million. So actually larger numbers than here. And the similarities are sort of spookily evocative, aren't they? Because he's also a decorated military vet who was very popular because of his service. Top Gun pilot. He also, at the beginning, completely denied all this and said, I will have my day in court. And really, I get the feeling that he really personally believed that he hadn't done anything wrong, which, you sometimes wonder what is going on in Washington, where all this evidence you produce, and there's still this reaction of like, I did nothing wrong. So he ended up resigning, and this may be what happens.
One thing that there, and I agree with everything he said, but there is a big distinction, I think, in their wrongdoings with Duke Cunningham and alleged wrongdoings, is that Duke was convicted basically of selling government contracts for bribes, and to a degree he was selling out the United States. I'm not saying that in any way that what Duncan Hunter is being accused of, but I think in the public mind, misusing campaign funds is a little different. Okay, there's private donors and stuff like that. It's not quite as heinous in some people's minds as, like I said, the bribery and really pocketing money for selling out the government.
All right, I did want to get on to the other Republican woes at the national level. Of course, this is a federal office as well. Donald Trump this week saw his former campaign chair guilty in a jury trial. He saw his personal lawyer plead guilty and implicate him in malfeasance. Let's start with a bite here. This is Donald Trump talking about Paul Manafort and Mr. Cohen this week, one after the other. Let's hear that.
I have great respect for what he's done in terms of what he's gone through. He worked for Ronald Reagan for years. He worked for Bob Dole. And I would say what he did, some of the charges they threw against him, every consultant, every lobbyist in Washington probably does. They make up stories. People make up stories. This whole thing about flipping, they call it. I know all about flipping. For 30, 40 years, I've been watching flippers. Everything's wonderful, and then they get 10 years in jail, and they flip on whoever the next highest one is, or as high as you can go. It almost ought to be outlawed. It's not fair.
In flippers, as we saw in the Manafort trial with Mr. Gates, and he turned evidence for the government there, they got to be corroborated. There's got to be other evidence than simply Michael Cohen saying something about the president.
This was a jury, and I mean, it's interesting listening to the president, and the New York Times did this story about how he's really sort of adopted mob lingo, and quite literally. He's talking about people flipping, and he's talking about people being rats. I mean, it's just, I guess you expect anything these days, but it still seems a little jarring coming from the president. But, and he's said nice things about Manafort. He has not said nice things about Cohen, who has pled guilty. So and he implicated the president, apparently. Where this is all going, who knows? But it's all going in a bad direction, at least. Jeff Sessions finally came out and confronted the Attorney General, confronted the president, saying, he's not going to let the Department of Justice be used, in a political way and so forth.
Getting back to what Jade was referring to, right?
Right, yeah, and I think that I don't know if people are finally starting to distance themselves from the president. There was this notion of all these people being loyal. Well, that's not happening anymore. Or the walls collapsing around him. I always caution to undersell Donald Trump is a mistake. He's a very smart guy, but this has been just a really strange week.
Well, what about GOP leaders in Congress? What have we heard them say regarding these?
Well, I think the Senate wished they had left town like the House did, because they're the ones all talking, and they're not happy about things. Look, somebody pleading and people convicting. I just saw some clips of saying that, these are crimes and this is a bad thing. But anything beyond that is speculation, and there's sort of that aspect. And some people have gone as far to say, there's nothing about Trump here. So they're still kind of, defending Trump. Some are, to a degree.
And Allison, I want to bring this back. Of course, we talked about Duncan Hunter, Chris Collins, another staunch supporter of the president, upstate New York, another Republican in trouble and indicted. Let's bring this back to the 49th race, which was Darrell Issa's seat. He stepped down. Now you have an open seat there, Republican and a Democrat. Do you think this woes for the Republicans overall might affect turnout there? Republicans just say, I'm sitting this one out, I'm tired of it.
Well, I mean, you've got to ask about the Democrats' resources, because they've been pouring resources into the 49th as being their best bet to flip the seat. And now they have a situation where really they have another opportunity. So it is kind of possibly going to pull some resources from the 49th, from the national level at least, into the 50th. I spoke to the Flip the 49th campaign, the local campaign today, and they're very gung-ho. They say they want to help the 50th to do the same thing they've done for the 49th now. It's really worthwhile for Democrats to get in there and see if they can use this opportunity to flip 2 seats. But it does raise questions as to dividing
yeah,
resources.
and I mean, even further in California, there's a handful of seats, I don't know, 7 or so, that they're looking at. And frankly, the 50th district, the Hunter district, was not originally one of them. That was such a safe Republican seat, even when he was under investigation, but now the indictments. So they have to make some choices, and they'll have to see as some polling comes up. Do they think Campa-Najjar can win? Because they actually think that they have some better shots in other seats, and the whole goal is to win the majority in Congress for the Democrats.
Now, does this, we only got a short time left here, but does this become really a national story? It's been a national story, that race with Hunter this week, and right on out to the rest of the campaign, a big focus on this now?
On the Campa-Najjar?
Yes.
I think so, but
Hunter.
in the context of the races, I mean, it's not going to just be focused on this, because there is this chessboard, and the 49th is still, although it hasn't been in the news, down here is the bigger race that
right.
to watch.
All right, we'll be talking about it a lot in the weeks to come as we go, and the election's sooner than you think. That does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Morgan Cook of the San Diego Union Tribune, Michael Smolens of the Union Tribune, Jade Heidemann of KPBS News, and Allison St. John, also of KPBS. Reminder, all the stories we discussed today available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.